Hello and welcome to Where the Bush is Burning. I'm your host, Tom Tice. Each week we gather together to have a conversation about Christ. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to spend some time looking into the Word of God, and Christ will be our primary focus. Today we're going to talk about an incident in the life of Christ which involves Peter, the disciple who was one of the three closest, Peter, James, and John. They were very close to Christ. And as Christ began to move toward the cross, there were several interactions which he had with his disciples, wherein Peter figures very largely. The one that we're going to concentrate on today is something that arose out of the Last Supper. Now, at the Last Supper, Christ was preparing his disciples for the crucifixion and all that would follow. And in the course of that, he revealed to them that one of them was going to betray him. He didn't identify Judas in a very specific way, but yet Judas did ultimately become identified as the one who was going to betray him. And Christ in the upper room was having a discussion with his disciples, and he was saying that all of them were going to forsake him and flee, and that this was going to happen that very night. Now, Peter took exception to this. Peter was, in many respects, an impetuous person. He was a very full-on person. He was all in or all out. That's the kind of person that Peter tended to be. And Peter was very strong about the idea that he was not going to forsake Christ, that he was not going to flee, and that he was going to be willing to die with Christ, and that was the profession that he made. And others were similar, but Peter was at the forefront. And early on, he became somewhat of a spokesman for the disciples. And so this was very characteristic of the way Peter behaved. So Peter declared that he was not going to deny Christ, that he was going to go to the death with him. And Christ comes back with a statement to Peter, and in that statement he says that before the cock would crow 3 times in the next morning, Peter would deny him 3 times. Rather, let me correct that. What he said was, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. So that's how the formula went. So Christ leaves the upper room. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. The most of the disciples stay on the outside edge. He takes Peter, James, and John. They go in with him a little farther into the garden, and he goes away about a stone's throw and kneels down and prays. And we have the recording of that. That's the prayer, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. So when we came back, the disciples, Peter, James, and John, were sleeping. And about that time, the mob rolled into the Garden of Gethsemane. And then they had this interchange, and Christ gives himself up to them. So they take him then to the palace of the high priest. And so they go into this courtroom situation. Now, they are basically trying him in a religious court. Peter follows, and as Peter follows, he goes into where Christ is in that same household. And people were coming and going, and so he came in, and he at first was at the outside, and then he went in a little closer and could see what was going on. And in the household, there were people who thought that Peter was one of the disciples. And they began to identify him. And the first time they did it, he said no. The second time they identified him as being one of the disciples, he said no a little more firmly. The third time, he began to curse and to swear and to declare that he didn't know Christ. And after he had denied him 3 times, Christ turned, because he could see him, and he looked at him, and the cock crew. Okay, the rooster crowed. So Peter was devastated. And he was so devastated that he went forth, he wept bitterly. He had done exactly what he said he would not do. He had done exactly what Christ said that he would do. And so Peter was completely shattered, absolutely and completely shattered. The net result of that, of course, was that then, when Christ rose from the dead, Peter was inclined, like the rest of them, to deny it. Ultimately, he and John went to the grave. They didn't encounter Peter. Mary Magdalene was at the grave. She did encounter the risen Christ. She was the first person to whom he revealed himself. And Peter, I believe, was at the lowest, perhaps, point of his entire spiritual life. I suspect he felt that he was no longer worthy to be a disciple. And so he did what very often people will do when they have failed at something. They go back to doing what they know how to do. Now, his trade was that he was a fisherman. And so the net result of that was that he said to the other disciples, I'm going to go fishing. And we find the record of this in John chapter 21. And I'm going to skip over the first portion of it. Basically, what happens is that he, in the sense, I'm not going to read it, but I'm just going to tell you the story. And we'll pick it up at the point at which he starts to have contact with Christ once again. So they go out, they fish all night, they don't catch anything. And in the morning, there's this figure walking on the seaside there. And when he calls to them and says, have you caught anything? And they say, no, we haven't. And so he says, well, cast your net on the other side of the ship. Well, there was a certain customary side, and there was a side that they typically didn't cast the net on. And he said, cast it on the other side. So when they cast it on the other side, all of a sudden they had this huge draft of fish, 153 in one net. So the disciples realized that this was the Lord. And they grabbed these fish, and then they were starting to move towards the shore. Peter was excited. He threw himself into the sea and swam to shore. And so they pulled the fish all in, and Christ said to them, bring some of the fish that you've caught. And he had a fire built already. He had food already cooking. And so they sat down and they ate breakfast. So none of them really recognized Christ. He, for one reason or another, was unrecognizable to them, although they were quite sure that it was him. So they're there at the seaside, and they've had their breakfast. And then I'm going to read the conversation that occurs between Christ and Peter after breakfast. So when they'd eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said, feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. And then he goes on to talk about something else. He says, most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. And this he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. When he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Now, there's some things that we want to consider here, things that can be very encouraging. Peter, when he failed, went back to doing what he knew he could do. So he had been a follower of Christ for 3 years. He had gone where Christ had gone. He'd heard what Christ had said. He had aspirations, spiritual aspirations. And when he denied Christ, all of that came crashing down. So there's a certain amount of conjecture, I will admit here. My estimation of what was going on there was because he had failed, because he had denied Christ, because he had done everything that he said he would not do, and had not done the things that he said that he would do, He considered that this was a complete failure, a disaster. And so what I find is the case very often with tradespeople is when they've gone out into some different venture and the venture hasn't worked out, they revert to what they know. Now, being a tradesperson myself, and I have been for years and years and years, decades really, I understand that when I have at times tried to do various things outside of my trade experience, some of those things have gone fairly well, some of those things have not. When they have not gone well, I have very often reverted to what I do know how to do, which is the trade work that I'm in. So I can see the logic of what Peter was doing here. He was reverting to what he knew. And so he said, I'm going to go fishing. So that was what he did. So, and the other disciples who were close to him or felt perhaps this was not a bad idea, they decided to go as well. So there they all were. And they fished and fished and fished, and it was very common for them to fish at night, and they hadn't caught anything. So then when Christ comes along the side of the sea there and says to them, have you caught anything? They say, no. He says, well, cast your net on the other side. And so they did, and then suddenly they had all these fish. Well, they recognized they had seen this kind of thing from Christ before, and they recognized who he was. And so this was very exciting to them because, of course, they thought he was dead. Now here he was, alive from the dead, resurrected. And so they became very excited. However, having said that, Peter, being the impetuous person that he tended to be, decided he wasn't going to wait. He jumped into the water and swam to shore. And so the net result of that was that they then gathered together. Christ said, bring some of the fish. They sat and had breakfast. And then Christ and Peter had this exchange. Now, there's two or three things about this that are important. First of all, as far as I can ascertain, Peter figured he was done spiritually. He figured there was no future for him in proclaiming the word of God. He was done. He was finished. And he went back to his trade. Very, very understandable. Christ, however, seeks him out, sits down, and restores him. And I want you to see in this an extremely valuable thing. Christ does not give up on us. Christ does not give up on us. Even when we fail, even when we deny him, even when we do things that are completely opposite to what he has taught, even when we completely and utterly make a mess of things, Christ is still on our side. Christ is still for us. So in this particular case, Peter had denied the Lord 3 times, denied him finally with cursing and swearing. That was the last time. He had cursed and swore that he didn't even know him. And Christ had looked at him, and then the cock crew, and Peter went out and wept bitterly. So he was, as far as he was concerned, done. He was finished. He had failed the Lord, and there was no way back for him. Christ came and sought him out and showed him that there was indeed a way back for him. Now, he does it in, I think, a very artful way. There are many commentators who will disagree with what I say about this. I, logically looking at this, think that this makes a lot of sense. Remember, Peter had denied him 3 times. Now, Christ sits down, and after breakfast, he carries on with this conversation with Peter, and he says, do you love me more than these people? That looking around, do you love me more than these? Peter says, Lord, you know that I love you. Now, there's some variations in the way he uses the word love, variations that don't come through in the English. I'm very fond of you. And then finally, he intensifies, uses language that's a little different towards the end, more intense, more emphatic. But the point that I'm making here is that Christ at first says, do you love me? And he says, yes, you know I love you. And then he says, feed my lambs. And then he goes through again the same formula, and then a 3rd time. And each time at the end, Peter affirms that he does love him. And then he says, feed my lambs, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. And so he tells him that he has a future with Christ, even though he's denied him. Now, he had denied him 3 times. He has 3 opportunities to affirm that he, in fact, does love Christ. I think that there's a logical connection there. I know some disagree with that. However, I think it's very sensible because in the mind of Peter, it would not, I think, have been enough for him to be able to affirm simply 1 time that he loved Christ. There was a certain intensification, just as there had been an intensification of his denial. So ultimately, there was an intensification of this return, if you will, this redemption, if you will. So he ultimately comes back and says, you know all things, you know that I love you. And Christ doesn't say to him, look, you denied me, you're done. You denied me with cursing and swearing. I don't have any more time for you. Christ pulls him back. Christ brings him back. Christ restores him. And I think it's very important for us to see. And it's important for us to see, I think, primarily for our own sake. Because herein lies the issue. All of us have denied Christ and failed him in one way or another. Sometimes it's been in large ways, sometimes in what we would consider perhaps smaller ways. But the fact is that we all have done things in the course of our lives, even as professing Christians, which you would think, well, that's the end of it for me. The Lord's not going to use me anymore for any reason. There's no way for me to continue on. I've denied the Lord too many times. I've failed the Lord in too many ways. He doesn't have any real future for me. Here is a very plain situation where Christ is dealing with someone who had been very close to him, followed him, heard his words, seen his miracles, watched him work, seen him die, and was now experiencing him as the resurrected Savior, who felt that he had no future. He felt that he had denied the Lord, that he was done, and that, I think, is the primary reason why he said to the other disciples, look, I'm just going to go fish, because he was reverting to what he knew. And when Christ arrived on the scene, it was important that they have this interchange. It was important that Christ revealed to him that he was not done with him, that he had every intention of using him, that he had a future for him. He said, feed my lambs, feed my sheep. He gave him some place to go, gave him hope, gave him knowledge of the fact that Christ, as far as he was concerned, had a future for Peter. And we see ultimately in the book of Acts, if we look in the book of Acts, that the first number of chapters are about how God used Peter. We have Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost. We have Peter healing the lame man in the temple and then preaching there. We have Peter standing up to the Sanhedrin. We have Peter in the first chapters of the book of Acts up to through chapter 12. He figures very largely in that whole situation. And God uses him mightily. At the first time he preaches, day of Pentecost, 3,000 souls are saved. On another occasion, 5,000. So we see this great movement of the Spirit of God, and we see Peter really at this point being the chief spokesman of the New Testament era of the Christian church. So at that point, we realize that God was not done with Peter, even though he had denied him, even though he had denied him with cursing and swearing, even though he had failed miserably. There was still redemption and restoration for him. And there was still usefulness for him. God still had a plan for Peter. God was still going to use him. So, what do we gather out of that for our own benefit? Well, all of us, I think, who are honest, recognize that we have failed the Lord often and that we have failed the Lord miserably. We have denied him in various ways. We've done things that weren't glorifying to him. We have failed on numerous occasions. We have, perhaps not in such a stark and graphic way as Peter under these circumstances, denied him. We've denied him perhaps in other ways. And yet we have, and having said that, we have been brought to the place where we think, well, there's really not much future for me. There's nothing more that I can do. I failed the Lord too often. I failed the Lord too miserably. There's no real future for me. I'm not going to be able to do anything much for the Lord. I'm just where I am. And so very often we revert to the things we know. We go back to our trades. We go back to the things that are most familiar. And we say, well, I'm not expecting anything else. Well, God was not done with Peter. Christ was not done with him, even though he had denied him very plainly and with cursing and swearing. And under those circumstances, Christ still had a place for him. Well, I think we can take hope from that. I believe that we can take courage from that, because even though we have failed the Lord, and I think all of us who are honest will admit that we have, even though we have failed the Lord, and sometimes rather miserably and in rather spectacular ways, yet Christ still has a place for us. He still has a plan for us. He still has a purpose for us. He still intends for us to bring him glory in various ways that he will lay out before us. In the case of Peter, he said, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. He gave him a job. He gave him a future. He gave him a hope. Christ said, or God said in the Old Testament, I know the thoughts that I think towards you, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Here we have him speaking to Peter, giving him a future and a hope, indicating that he's not done with him. He has things for him to do, and that he's going to glorify God. And ultimately, he was going to be given a martyr's death. So he was going to win the crown of the martyrs. And so he had a future for Peter. He had some place for him to go, something for him to do, something for him to accomplish. Well, I think we can take courage from that. I think we can be encouraged by that. We may have failed the Lord rather miserably and rather spectacularly ourselves, and I think any of us who are honest are going to put up our hand on that and say, well, yeah, that's true. I have done that sort of thing. Well, in this particular context, there was a way back for Peter. Christ allowed him to come back, forgave him, gave him a future, gave him a hope, gave him an opportunity to glorify Christ in the future. And ultimately, he did. He died a martyr's death. And ultimately, Peter did succeed in accomplishing everything that God intended for him to accomplish. So today, if you say, well, no, I've made too many mistakes as a Christian. There's no way back for me. There's no future for me as a servant of God. Take heart. In the case of Peter, there were circumstances which were very hard circumstances. He had to come to terms with them. Christ was very gracious to him, allowed him to affirm certainly that he loved him. He had denied him 3 times. Ultimately, he ended up professing his faith in Christ and his love for Christ on 3 occasions here in this one particular circumstance. Christ was very gracious to him, brought him back, made something out of him, and used him for his honor and his glory. If he did for Peter, then we have hope that he'll do that same thing for us. All of us have failed Christ in various ways. All of us have in various ways denied him or done that which was not glorifying to him. We have hope that Christ will bring us back, that Christ will make use of us, that Christ will give us a place to contribute to the advancement of his kingdom. So I say this for your encouragement today. Once again, I'm your host, Tom Tice. This is Where the Bush is Burning. We would love for you to like and subscribe. That would be wonderful if you would do that. If you want to read our devotional, it comes out every day at hopeharbor.church. That's hopeharbor.church. Once a week, we also have a message that we put up on a Sunday from Hope Harbor Church, so you're welcome to listen to that. If you would like to subscribe to our devotional on Substack, you can do that. It is listed on Substack under Where the Bush is Burning. It will show up in your email. And tune in again next week. Thank you very much for being a part of what we're doing here today. I trust that the Lord will bless you and that you'll be encouraged in the things of God as the result of what we do.